Good morning, this is Gaming Perspectives with
Saul
and Jolene, and today we're talking about how crunchy do you like your role-playing game?
Crunchy, yes. What is crunchiness? We've used that term before, and we kind of gave it an explanation or definition.
You've used the term before.
Yes. So for us, we believe crunchy is complex.
Why do you say we?
Because you
just talk about yourself.
You don't want me to include you? That's fine. So I think crunchy is complexity. How complex is an RPG? And another question is, why do people like crunchy games or complex games? Now, I'm going to go back in the old days when I first started in 1978, and people of that era, I think most games that were being made were crunchy. They were just by where they were coming from, which was people who played miniature games, people who played war games. When D&D came out, that's where it was coming from, and so a lot of people mimicked that style of play.
I think that if you ever have a chance, you should go to a convention, if we ever get to go back to conventions, and go into the room where they're playing miniature games,
right, with
their rulers and their little guys and their charts.
Yes,
and then you will understand what crunchy is.
Right. So, coming from that era, I know why people like crunchy games, because a lot of the gamers, the first RPG players, were in fact old miniature and war gamers. So it makes sense that the games that they played represented that kind of liking of charts and complexity, and also they were trying to mimic or trying to be realistic. They were trying to be simulationist. So I can understand why the first RPGs were kind of complex, and the fact that nobody had really done it before, and so putting the idea of a simulation and this burgeoning idea of a role-playing game came out with some pretty complex games at the very beginning of the RPG hobby.
There's still very complex games today. Right.
So I was saying, I understand why older gamers like crunchy games or start out with crunchy games, because that's all it was, or that's where the hobby was coming from. It was coming from old miniature and wargamers. So we have D&D, which, by not today's standards, originally is probably not that complex. It was just kind of weird ideas and rules. But at the same time, it woke a lot of people up to the possibility of role playing instead of playing a specific unit in a war game. So a lot of games came out of that idea. So we have games like, the first games were mimicking that kind of pattern. So we have games like FGU, Fantasy Games Unlimited, had Star Wars, had Space Opera, had Aftermath. We have games like superhero games coming out a little later called Champions, which later would be mimicked by Hero. Hero was a superhero game. A little bit later on, we have I would consider Shadowrun kind of complex, but that, you're talking about games in the mid 80s. But still, you got people, like I said, people who were coming from the hobby that was miniature and war games.
You would consider Shadowrun a little complex?
Okay, the first edition is a little complex. Yes, more complex than not. How's that? Now, 5th edition just goes crazy, but I'm just talking about in the 80s. So I understand why people back then liked crunchy games, because basically that's what they liked about war games and miniature games. But that's not the case anymore, right?
People still like crunchy games. What are you talking about?
No. The case is that they're not necessarily, most role-playing players are not coming from miniature and war games, right? Like Augustine, I don't think has ever played Warhammer 40K or Warhammer or any large war game. Like,
nobody's played war games with you,
right? We played Axis and Allies and stuff like that.
And the one with the two different where one is the United States and one is Germany, just two people.
Oh yeah, I forget what
World War II game.
Not Axis and Allies.
No.
I don't remember now.
It's a board game. It's got all the little chits.
A lot of chits. I don't remember, but he has played those. But he originally started playing not any kind of war game or even board games. He really saw us playing, me playing, and wanted to play with us. And I said, well, you need to learn the rules and stuff like that. So the rules at the time was Pathfinder. So he cut his teeth on Pathfinder, and it was just happened to be the role playing game that me and my friends were playing. So he grew up playing Pathfinder even as a little kid. So I understand my son. Well, my son is a good example of a new role player, right? He's 17. He started playing, I'd say, when he was 4 or 5, and then he really didn't start playing Pathfinder because what I was doing was running made-up games in my own head that were reminiscent of D&D, but really wasn't. It was more like a counting game.
Because he was little.
Yeah, he was 4 years old and 5 years old. He was learning how to count. But I think when he was 7 or 8, that's when he started reading the Pathfinder book.
They were in first grade.
Okay, so that's 6 years old. Okay, I don't remember. Well, okay, so obviously my memory is a little fuzzy. But yeah, so he was really young. And I was astounded that he was reading the Pathfinder book.
Well, you told him he had to be able to read the rules to be able to play the game.
And I think that really egged him on. And his friends.
So him and Ian sat down and Ian helped him with the words because he's 3 years older.
Yes.
And then him and Alan just took off reading the Pathfinder rule book. Which, if you got a kid that needs to learn to read, there's a good book because then they ask you lots of questions about words.
Yeah, there's quite a few, and there's archaic words in there, right? Like
archaic
words for like different types of weapons and stuff.
Like archaic.
Okay. So there you have it. So not this idea that I have in my head that old wargamers and miniature gamers are now role-playing gamers is not true anymore. So a lot of new gamers are exposed to D&D specifically because of shows, our actual plays like Critical Role. I know Jolene's never seen Critical Role. She might have seen 1 or 2 episodes.
That's not true. I've seen parts of episodes.
And then there's like Joe Magliano, who's an actor who actively plays D&D or has come back to the hobby, and he's a
I don't think he ever left it.
I think he did. He stopped playing because he was talking about getting the group together and stuff like that. So he started playing, and there's been some stories on him playing Dungeons and Dragons and how that has led him to his acting career and stuff like that. And there's a tabletop by Will Wheaton. He's he usually plays a board game, but he's also played and ran in RPGs. I think one of them was Fate. So you're getting a lot of these new players that have no war game or miniature background, and they're interested in D&D or they're interested in role playing. They're like, oh yeah, or the Big Bang Theory, right? There's all kinds of popular media that exposes people to role playing games, and people go, well, I've always been curious, so I want to play. And some of those people actually like crunchy games.
When you say crunchy, you mean that there's lots of different things you have to figure out, right? Like not only from making your character where there's all kinds of stats and feats and things that you need to decide on.
The more stuff you need to decide on makes it more complex, yes.
So I think that it's not just war gamers and stuff, but people in general that like complex stuff. Like people that like really heavy board games that I walk away from. Right.
Well, I was just about to mention that. So board games are huge right now. They're come out with easy over 1,000 games a year. I don't know about last year, since last year 2020 was a weird year, right? But board games are really, really popular, and a lot of new people are playing board games. And along with board games, there's a lot of people who like the real complex games. The real strategic. There's a mechanism that they like. That you got to figure it out. They got the engine building and all this other stuff. A lot of games like those don't usually hit our table in our house because Jolene and our friends don't feel like spending 3 to 4 hours playing a single game when they could play 4 other games possibly, and not not put too much time into one game and then end up losing because I think they're just super competitive. Well, I mean, we used to be able to play games that were really long, like History of the World by Avalon Hill, even Axis and Allies, Risk and stuff like that, even though they're not really super complex, but they just took a long time. Civilization, but Jolene doesn't have that experience. Maybe Monopoly as a long game that took forever and didn't like. But they don't like playing one single game all night. That just doesn't sound like fun to them. But other people do, like Feast of Odin, Kanban, Vinos. Those are games that are Terra Mystica. There's a lot going on in the game. There's a lot of things to figure out, and they're just really, really complex. So if people like that are sort of interested in RPGs and they come over to playing RPGs, they might like complicated games. They might not mind the math or the complexity of figure things out. And the more choices they have in an RPG, the more they like it. Like our son, this math head, and his friends who are like, oh, if I do this, if I make this choice down the road at 3rd level, 5th level, 7th level, or down the road, I can get this other skill or feat or magic power that'll really make my character powerful. I think that's one reason why he said, I want to go back and play Pathfinder. Because he kind of misses that, and D&D doesn't have that anymore.
That's okay. We play Shadowrun. He gets a little bit complicated there.
Jeez, yes. So
Shadowrun is very crunchy, and I think one of the things about crunchy games is there's lots of dice rolling and tables to look at.
Right, I totally agree. That's an we talked about Shadowrun before. We even did an episode on Shadowrun, and I was like, I'm still surprised that 5th edition is as complex as it is, because I don't remember the 1st and 2nd edition being that complex. But what is interesting, I heard that
that's okay. Felipe said you were playing it wrong, so it probably was. And
I'm not going to disparage my brother on the podcast, but his memory is not the best. But anyway, but unlike other games, Shadowrun really digs into that crunchiness, right? Because you've been there with me when I'm trying to figure out, what does this mean? How does magic really work? What do I have to roll to make it work? And we've read over and over.
Well, not only read, but watched videos.
Yes. It wasn't until we watched videos of other people explaining, not the rules, not the rule book, because maybe they're just bad at writing rules, because it didn't really help. Because I would read the combat section. I must have read it 5 times when people really when Jolene wanted to play it, and I'm like, okay, I can run it. So I went out and bought the 5th edition. I'm like, holy crap, this is 500 something pages, and a lot of it is rules. So I was kind of shocked. And to me, that seemed a little bit too much complexity. Or I'm at a stage where nice, easy games are best for me, because it lets me get to the action easier. Right? Well,
the boys loved Shadowrun. Yeah. They loved the total crunchiness, the total complexity, and the idea that you have all of these. You have money, you have karma, and you get to choose different things with it, right? And you get to when you're creating your character, and they read all the different types of characters, and of course they went with these crazy builds of really complex people with lots of cybernetics and different things, so that they could do what they wanted to do.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, wow. And like I said, if they like Pathfinder, then Shadowrun is like Shadow Math, or whatever we call it, Mathfinder, because it's just really complex.
But it's fun. I mean, all of the crunchiness makes the game a lot of fun, because it's the interaction at the table, right? Of, well, what does this rule mean? And then them trying to decide what it means, and how many dice do you really get to roll to, what does soak mean, and all of these different things. And when you pull out 32 dice for rolling to hit somebody, you're like, okay, I should be able to get 5 or 6 6s, right? Or 5s. Is that the one where you get 5s too?
Yeah,
okay.
5s and 6s.
So, but to me it doesn't matter, because I got these guys sitting around me, the Augustine and the boys, and even Steve and Jason. They all know all the things. So
right.
So if I go, I want to do this spell, and this is the force I want to use, and this is what I think is going to happen, and then if I'm right, I'm like, yes, I got it right. And if I'm wrong, they'll explain to me what it is I really need to do. So that makes it really fun for me, not only because the boys are just having fun and reading the rules and into the what's going on. Then if I throw a fireball at something and start stuff on fire, they're like, why did you do that? And then they like it because it was action, right? And then they get to explain, they get to actually do stuff, right? And not just talk about it.
And I think I've said it before already. I don't mind crunchy games as long as I'm playing them, right? If I have to run them, it's a different game. It's a different situation. Unless it's like I say, even Shadowrun has a lot of rules and stuff. But like I said in the past, a lot of that is on the player's shoulders. All that crunch. The only problem is me devising things or events that will be able to, one, exercise that itch they have, scratch that itch of them wanting to apply all these rules and their machinations of their character build and stuff, and me being able to stay on par with them and be able to present situations that they will be happy to play in, which means enemies that are comparable to their skills, enemies that are difficult to eliminate or get past. That is, the weight comes back on my shoulders. I got to figure out what's going to be a good fight or a good situation for them to figure out, for these characters and the players to figure out. But I do love the setting. I really like the setting of Shadowrun. That's the reason I keep playing 5th edition. I haven't looked at 6th edition. I don't know. I just think I'll just stay with 5th edition since I have all the books and stuff. Crunchy games. My idea is that I think people who like crunchy games really do like that strategy. They really like manipulating their character to a point where they feel that I can take anything that the GM throw at me. And especially if you have a group like that they can be very dominant in most combat encounters. Now you throw a social encounter at them, they might be a little bit taken back, which is kind of fun to see too. Do you like crunchy games, Julie? I mean, it seems like you don't mind them as long as the players around you explain to you the crunchier bits of it, right? Like you were talking, we played, I don't think you played Space Opera with me, but you played in my brother's game at a convention.
Oh, Space Opera is the thing about Space Opera is a percentile, right? And there's enough charts to just knock you over your head because you can't. There's charts for where you hit and how you hit and which part of the body, all kinds of weird things. But that was the time I did play Space Opera. Felipe was running it, and it was really fun. But there was a lot of math involved, and I couldn't tell when you were supposed to roll high or low, so I had to keep asking people.
Yeah, there was that. I remember running Space Opera, and I remember, what was it Felipe said that he said about some game. I think it was it Morgan he said didn't like crunchy games. He goes, it's really crunchy. And then Felipe, what did he say? He said that, once you play it 2 or 3 times, it becomes easy. I think it was Flames of Freedom. We were talking about that.
Oh.
So Flames of Freedom is this Wylander game that was Kickstarted late last year. And we had a quick start rules, and we were playing that. And one of our players, our fellow players in our RPG group, Morgan, he goes, it's kind of crunchy. I don't really like it. It was too hard. And Felipe said, well, crunchy games, play them 2 or 3 times, it gets easy. And I think that's true. I think that's true for Space Opera. Now, I think the only problem I have with Shadowrun is that we don't play as often as we play other games, and so we forget how things work, or I do. Maybe not my son and his friends and other players.
Well, Space Opera was a lot of fun because of the setting, the characters, the different things you could do. But it was easy for me because I was playing with Steve and Chris. And they both they'd either both played before or they just figured out the system was like not that hard to them, where I'm looking at the chart going, I have no clue as to what this means.
And those are simplified charts that we had made.
Yes, I know. And I was still confused by them. But I had a lot of fun because it was fun to, one, watch the guys argue about rules, and two, the scenario was cool. So all I did was I finally got tired of listening to Felipe explain it to me and just told him, tell me if I have to roll high or low and tell me which way.
And tell you what to roll.
Yeah, which dice am I rolling and what am I aiming for? That's all I need to know, so I know if I make it or not. But that is a little bit too crunchy. Also, Traveler, when you're creating a character and your character dies before you get done creating it, I don't
know if that's considered crunchy.
I don't know, but that's just weird. And then
people love that.
But Traveler has weird charts, and stuff where you have to.
Well, they're talking about the combat charts, I think.
Yes,
or are you talking about the
combat
character
charts?
You're talking about the character creation charts where you look at on a table to see what skill you got.
Yeah, that wasn't too hard because it was just rolling the dice. But the combat charts, you pulled out this thing for Phil that was like this huge spreadsheet thing, and I'm like going, no, I'm not going to look at that.
It's the mother of all charts.
Just tell me when I'm supposed to roll, and you would think Traveler would be easy because it's just 2d6 that you're rolling.
Well, that's why like we were discussing Liminal, which uses 2d6, and all you need is an 8 usually to succeed. Now, depending on how complex something is or how hard it is to accomplish, you can raise that number to 9, 10, 11, 12.
It's not easy to roll an 8.
On 2 6-sided dice?
Yeah.
But you get to add your skill, just like Traveler. And Liminal is the same thing. But for some reason, Liminal was exceedingly much easier to play than Traveler for you.
Yeah, because one, I didn't have to know what a parsec was and which way the spaceship would go and things like that, which were just mind-boggling to me. But it was other than that, I thought that was really crunchy. The charts and the game, and it was really it seemed more, and I know it was obviously one of the first games, one of the first role-playing games, but yes, it seemed really, very, very, I don't know how you would explain it, like hard to understand. When I had to read the rules, Augustine and I read the rules like 4 times trying to make characters. And he understood them, but it was like the 4th time when he finally got it.
And that was a copy of the original 3 Little Books.
Yes,
I believe.
Yes, it was.
Yes.
We were and we were looking at it on the computer, and he would read the paragraph, and I would read the paragraph, and then we would try to figure out what the paragraph meant for our character.
Well, you got to remember that came out in 1977, so those rules have been, let's say it was in the works in 1976, 75.
Well, then we had there was some reboot of it. I don't know, but it's just as complicated because I had to watch a video on it to figure out, and then in the video they go, well, you could go one way or the other.
Oh, there was a specific question on something. I forget what it was exactly, and there was an interpretation of the rules, right?
Yes.
And one set of people interpreted it one way, and another set of people interpreted it the other way, which I thought was weird. But I think.
Which was true because your brother and some of the players interpreted it differently when we were playing it.
Right. I think it was Philip and then Felipe. And
Felipe goes, no, this is the way that we've always done it.
Yes. Which doesn't mean anything because sometimes we did things wrong.
But the more crunchy it is, I think the more interpretation you have.
Right. That's true. I think for the most part, I remember playing Space Opera and running Space Opera and playing Traveler, and I don't remember it being such a big deal. I think the old style of crunchiness where you had to look stuff up in charts, that's pretty passe. That's really old school, right? And I think more recent crunchiness is more doesn't rely on charts like that. For example, Rollmaster, right? Even Space Opera. Space Opera had all these charts. A lot of them were like. There were simply so many charts because they had so many weapons, and each weapon had its own different characteristics, and so they had to have a chart of every single weapon that they wanted to include in this science fiction game. And because it was science fiction, that they literally went from, they had tech levels, much like Traveler, tech level 0, which is like caveman, to tech level 10 and plus, and they had examples of weapons from all those eras, right? And every tech level was a different level of civilization in the game. So there was a chart of sword, broadsword, poleaxe, right? And each weapon had its chart on how effective it would be against certain kinds of armor. And they had all kinds of different armor, from simple leather armor to powered armor.
Okay, you have to stop.
Right? So that's why there was so many charts. The other charts, it was to hit table. It tried to use a lot of examples of, because it was percentile system. If you were shooting from a moving car, that was my or moving object, minus 25%. If the object was moving faster than 25 miles an hour, it's minus 45%. And then so there was all these things included, or tried to be. They try to include everything they could think of, which is an enormous task. And so you're like, oh my god, there's all these things. If you're shooting with your offhand, -5%, and it just went nuts. And so I think that's where you're like, man, this is a lot of charts. Just simply because, like I said earlier, that they try to be simulationist in the sense that we want to be able to present this game and give people as much information as they can to run the game, which I think sometimes they would go overboard.
But if you think about it, that's one of the things that people complain about today is that people, when they're playing role-playing games, are not as realistic as they should be. They say that if you're playing D&D, you're totally unrealistic about what's going to happen if you get hit. Healing potions aren't going to bring you all the way back to life and stuff like that. So
well, that's
maybe that's why they had so many charts, because they wanted to be realistic.
Oh yeah, no, definitely, and they wanted to include as much as they could, so the GM wouldn't have to come up with stuff on his own.
All I have to say about charts is we played Paladin, and
that was an adventure too.
It was in the adventure. There was a chart. It was a random chart, and someone's horse died, and I felt really bad because I didn't realize what the chart was until we were already in the middle of the chart, and I'm like, why did they put this here? But it was interesting, and I understand why it was there, because it's kind of old school, right? But I felt really bad.
You wouldn't write an adventure like that, though, with a chart.
I wouldn't have a chart. Well, and I didn't use any chart after that chart.
So that's an interesting aspect of a Paladin is a redoing of the rules of Pendragon, but instead of Arthurian legend, it's based on the
Charlemagne,
the Knights of Charlemagne, right? Paladin. And there was some adventure book that either I bought or came with the core rulebook.
It was in the core rulebook.
It was in the core rulebook. It's interesting. I'm not sure the person who came up with Paladin was from the United States. I'm not sure. People have different ideas coming from different countries, have different ideas what crunchiness is or what it means. I think he was trying to, that guy, whoever wrote that adventure, was really harkening back to the old days where if you were climbing the Pyrenees Mountains or whatever it was, you would roll on this chart to see what happens. And this chart was roll your horse skill or whatever it was. I forget what skill it was. And then
it was like an endurance thing to see what would happen to you.
And it was really, you're right, it was really weird because like
sometimes you took damage just because you rolled a 5 instead of a 2.
If you didn't make your roll, your horse died. If you didn't make your roll, you fall off your horse and you take this amount of damage. And that's all there was to it. There was no other mitigating circumstances other than this one die roll. And I think that kind of weirded you out because it was like, it seemed so random.
Well, I felt really bad because I killed Jim's horse, and I didn't use a chart after that. I just skipped the charts. But that was me because I felt bad for killing somebody's horse for no apparent reason other than the dice roll.
Other than there was a chart in there that said to do it. And that was in the adventure. I think, like I said, that's kind of like, I think that's kind of really seemingly seems like old school ideas. Like, I remember.
Well, just to randomize the encounter, right? So to make it more random. You're rolling a dice to see what happens, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what's going on other than you're going up this mountain, right?
Yeah. I think, like I said, I would have the same problem because I don't like the idea of a one die roll, hit or miss, fail. It's like save or die, right? That kind of roll or chart.
But it wasn't, I mean, I guess Paladin and what's the other one? Pendragon are rather crunchy systems in a way that there's the good quality and the bad quality, right? And you have to, depending on
all those traits,
the traits and what you're doing, and there's all kinds. The character sheet is like a huge chart because everything is the whole page is filled in with stuff.
There's the whole trait system, which I really like.
I think it's really cool. I'm not saying and I don't mind crunch or anything like that. It's just it makes it more interesting to role play.
Right, I agree. And there's a lot of skills in that game, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think
it's a bird outside.
That's what it is. I keep hearing something. Threw me off track, that damn bird. So crunchiness, I think a lot of people still like it. I think we're gonna be stuck with people who like crunch. You know, For example, look at Shadowrun. I don't know how popular Shadowrun was, but it's still around. I mean, it survived 5th edition, massive crunch, and it came out with a 6th edition. There is D&D. D&D is considered not a light game, a little bit more crunchier. It's not quite as crunchy as Pathfinder, right?
And Pathfinder's like, people love it.
And people like it.
And Starfinder's even more crunchy, in my opinion.
Well, Starfinder is the 2nd edition of, it uses the 2nd edition rules, kind of. What would become 2nd edition Pathfinder?
Well, the thing about Starfinder is they added space to it, and when I played it, the space travel was just really. I was tired though, I will admit, but people really like those charts for that space travel.
You know what's funny is that the space game part of Starfinder is very close to space opera. Space opera is played with graph paper on a. Of course, it's not quite 3 dimensions, so it's just kind of weird. But I think it was interesting when we pulled out the graph paper and we're.
Oh my gosh, Felipe was like, he took to it like a duck to water because he must have done it before, the space travel thing.
Well, yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of games that.
Not me. I was trying to figure out what you guys were talking about, and I know I was tired because we were at a convention, but I was like
falling asleep.
I was looking at the guy going, "What?" I thought I was really excited to play Starfinder, and then when I was very not put off by the space travel, but it was a lot harder for me than it should have been.
The DM was really nice. He was a really nice guy, and it was an introductory scenario. And the weird thing about that is that it tried to introduce you to all the different aspects of Starfinder, from personal. This is what is it? This is an encounter that deals with personal combat. This is an encounter that deals with social interactions. And then, of course, they had to put a little thing in there about space combat, which I thought was kind of interesting. But it was really late, and you were really tired, and not in the mood for that stuff. Like I said, the crunchy games are still around. They're not as popular, meaning there's not a whole bunch of them as there used to be, or almost all games that came out were crunchy. And then now, with this era of lighter games, of less cumbersome rules and stuff, I think less people play crunchy games. Overall percentage of the whole role playing.
I think some people would argue with you on that point.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I think like D&D 5th edition is outselling Pathfinder, and Pathfinder 2nd edition. I'm sure. Just look at how many people who play.
I'm just saying that I could find a room at a convention where everybody would disagree with you.
Yes, the Pathfinder room. Yes, I understand.
Not only the Pathfinder room, but the miniature room and the rooms where those guys have those, they've been playing Champions for 30 years or however long. And, they have lots of different games like that.
Right. And there's no doubt about people still play crunching games. But like I said, overall percentage of the group of percentage of the people who play role-playing games, I think crunchiness is slightly dipping in the recent past. It might make a resurgence. I mean, people, we'll see how second edition Pathfinder does. There's Shadowrun 6th edition. See how popular that is. They try to streamline it a little bit, I've heard, but it's still a very crunchy game. So I think crunchy games are here to stay. They're not going anywhere. They're not as popular. I don't think they're as popular as they used to be, simply because there's the barrier to entry, right? If you're going to start out, I remember this, I think I've told this story before, but I was listening to this other podcaster whose wife did not play the role-playing games. And he decided that, he tried to get her to play, finally she said yes, and he started with her by making a Pathfinder character.
Oh, that's probably not the best idea.
So I don't think they even got past finishing making the character, and she decided she didn't want to play this hobby anymore, to his terrible chagrin, right? He was like, oh man, that was like, and he admits it himself. He said that was probably the worst game.
If you want to get someone to play, make the character for them.
There's that, or start them off with a slightly easier game. But what are you gonna do?
I don't know.
Well, like I said, my introduction to role playing was original D&D. My son's introduction to role playing games was Pathfinder, simply because that was the fantasy game that I was running, and it was the game that we were all playing. So that's the game that he decided that he was stuck with because that's the game we were running. Now, if I was still running AD&D, he might have been hooked on AD&D, but it was Pathfinder, and so I think he has this idea that he played that as a little kid, so it's kind of nostalgic for him. So
he's only 17, so he doesn't have a lot.
No, I was gonna say, but I mean, he's mentioned it a couple of times that he would like to try to play Pathfinder again because 5th edition isn't as crunchy.
There you go.
There you go. So I don't know what you can say, but I think crunchy games are here to stay. I would love to play them, not necessarily run them.
This is Gaming Perspectives with
Saul
and Jolene.
You have a good day.